What's going on, guys? Welcome back. And now that I've finally watched Oppenheimer, I figured there's no better time for me to rank all of Christopher Nolan's films, of which there are 12 at this point. And as I mentioned in my recent review of Oppenheimer, Nolan is one of, if not my favorite filmmaker of all time. He's one of the few directors still out there pushing the boundaries of filmmaking by creating entertaining, thought-provoking films which challenge the audience's perception of reality through their exploration of complex themes and concepts. Obviously, there will be some unpopular opinions, or what I'm sure some people consider to be odd placements on this list. Avid viewers of my channel will know that's nothing new for me, but I will try my best to explain why certain films receive the spots that they do, because this was an extremely difficult ranking. This is a guy whose films usually range from being a 9 to a 10 out of 10. Even when I don't love one of Nolan's films, I still respect the immense amount of effort and thought put into crafting it. However, there is one exception, and that outlier is none other than Tenet, a film that on the surface level shares many of the strengths of Nolan's other films. An awesome score, beautiful cinematography, and impressive practical action sequences. All of those elements are just as good as you'd expect. Where the problem comes in is the script here just kind of sucks. The characters might as well be exposition robots, because none of them feel like real people. I mean, hell, the main character is literally called the protagonist. He doesn't even have a name. In the Nolan Variations, a book accounting a series of interviews between the author, Tom Schoen, and Christopher Nolan, Nolan himself states that his intention behind that was to pay homage to characters like the Man with No Name or James Bond, the aloof gunslinger/super spy. And while I can understand what he was trying to go for, it didn't work for me, because leaving that character nameless creates a disconnect between him and the audience. In addition to that, the film has no deeper theme or message to be taken away from it. It has the concept, but it lacks the character and emotional core needed to keep me invested in this type of film. At the end of the day, all I remember from Tenet is some of the imagery and the action scenes. And at that point, all you have left is meaningless noise. Many people say that it's best for directors to be given complete creative freedom over their films. I usually share that sentiment, but this will always stand out to me as one of the rare cases where a director being given total creative freedom was to a film's detriment. Moving on to number 11, I have Following, Nolan's first ever film that I only got around to watching for the first time a few months ago, and it's surprisingly solid for having almost zero budget. Now, the attempts at action or violence are hilariously unconvincing, and the acting can be kind of stilted at points, although that may have been the intention. The plot is fairly simplistic, but it all comes together by the end with a satisfying twist capping off the story. This is in many ways the prototype Nolan film because much of his signature style can be seen on display, with his toying around with the concept of time and his reliance on non-linear storytelling. I wouldn't call this an amazing film by any means, but it showed what Nolan was capable of. All he needed was a higher budget and more resources. At number 10, I have Memento. Another simple story from Nolan, but told in a highly ambitious manner, because as many of you already know, this film is structured almost completely backwards. It's an incredibly unique type of filmmaking, one that I've never seen before and will probably never see again. It'll be damn near impossible for anyone to retell this story in the same way Nolan did here. But it's also one of the few Nolan films where there's no clear good guy to root for. Every character's motives can and should be called into question. We may find ourselves sympathizing with Leonard, Guy Pearce's character, but once everything falls into place, we realize that we should never have been rooting for him to begin with. The film has a clear message of how vengeance traps us in an endless cycle of self-destruction, but when it ends, unlike a lot of other Nolan films, I don't come away from it feeling uplifted, inspired, or contemplating the meaning of life. Instead, I come away from it thinking, man, that was messed up. Granted, this isn't a problem with the film, but it makes it one that I can't see myself revisiting frequently, if at all. I know some of you will kill me for this, but coming in at number 9, I have Inception. In many ways, Nolan's most personal film. He's stated on multiple occasions that this was the film he'd wanted to make for his entire career leading up to this point, and you can tell that many of his films preceding this one, like Following and Memento, laid the groundwork for this, which is the perfected version of the film he had been trying to make previously. The concept of this group, who are essentially dream thieves, is fun and creative. The personal story of Leonardo DiCaprio and his wife, as well as Cillian Murphy reconnecting with his father, ground the film emotionally and provide it with a strong underlying theme. It has all the key ingredients which make a great Nolan film. So, why is it this low on my list? Well, to put it simply, I just find those elements aren't woven together as seamlessly as they usually are in Nolan's films. It's never connected with me personally. Inception works as a technically impressive piece of filmmaking, but it's never struck a chord with me the same way it has with so many other people. That is absolutely personal bias, and does not diminish the objective quality of the film. But this is my subjective ranking after all, so that's why it receives this spot on my list. Have any of you noticed that a lot of the titles of Nolan's films start with in? Insomnia, Inception, Interstellar. Just something worth noting. But in all seriousness, I believe Insomnia is Nolan's forgotten gem. Many people refer to it as his attempt at making a murder mystery, but I'd argue it's not that at all. In fact, the mystery gets solved in the first half of the film. Rather, it's a lesson in morality, that it's never too late to do the right thing, even after you've committed yourself to a reprehensible course of action. I guess the imagery isn't as mind-blowing as some of Nolan's later works, but the locations used are still quite beautiful and evocative of the way the characters are feeling. I honestly think Detective Dormer has one of the best character arcs in any Nolan film, and the ending scene gives me goosebumps every time. As previously stated, this might very well be Nolan's most underrated movie. He dipped his toes into a different genre with this one, and in my opinion, he created the best film he possibly could have. At number 7, Batman Begins. What can I say that hasn't already been said? It's a great start to a fantastic trilogy of films. Some of the hand-to-hand combat scenes are a bit shaky and incomprehensible, but everything else more than makes up for that. This is the definitive superhero origin film, and every attempt to replicate it has failed. It's actually kind of hilarious to see how more recent films like Iron Man and Doctor Strange have tried to copy it by using similar plot points, images, and locations, while misunderstanding that what made this film work was the sense of realism it was able to achieve. Something I didn't know until reading the Nolan variations is that this film wasn't originally meant to be about Bruce Wayne. and instead Howard Hughes. But since Martin Scorsese started directing The Aviator around this same time, it was reconstructed into a Batman film. It's just kind of interesting to think that what was originally meant to be a biopic transformed into one of the best superhero movies ever made. Coming in at number 6, I have Oppenheimer. And I'll keep this brief since I've already reviewed this film, but it might be my favorite biopic of all time, despite the fact that many of us already know the life story of J. Robert Oppenheimer. That doesn't make the tension feel any less real. The score, sound design, direction, and phenomenal cinematography makes everything feel so much bigger than it actually is. A harrowing look into the broken mind of a man ridden with guilt over the deaths of thousands of people as a result of something he created is not something we'd usually think of as a big summer blockbuster, but Nolan combines all the fundamental aspects of filmmaking to generate even more excitement from interviews and court hearings than the audience would get out of watching car chases and explosions in a less intellectual film. The reason why it sits comfortably in the middle of my list for the time being is because I'm waiting to see if it will hold up at home as well as it did watching it on the big screen. Even with that being said, in modern times, it's hard to find anything much better than this. Bringing us into the top 5, we have The Prestige, one of the strangest concepts for a film that Nolan has directed. A very surface-level description of it would be to say, it's about two magicians trying to one-up each other by performing the ultimate magic trick. How do you take that and turn it into a dark, unsettling story about ego and ambition? Well, only Christopher Nolan knows the answer to that question. The dynamic between Christian Bale's Borden and Hugh Jackman's Angier is constantly engaging. You never really know what's going on or what's about to happen next, but once you get to the end and the twists start occurring, it's absolutely mind-blowing. The Prestige is one of those rare films that gets better on repeat viewings. Every time I rewatch it, I notice some new subtle detail that I wouldn't have thought about on my first time around. And even beyond that, it's a good cautionary tale about not allowing your passion to corrupt you. These two men are so passionate about their craft to a point where it destroys their lives and the lives of everyone around them. There's something valuable to be taken away from that. No matter how passionate we are about something, whether it be filmmaking, writing, or even illusionism, we should never let that damage us or those we care about. Once again, this is a film that should not work as well as it does, but thanks to Nolan's magic touch, it's one of the best of its kind. At number 4, I have The Dark Knight. Some of you are probably asking, what? It's not at number 1? As I said earlier, that's what happens when your filmography consists of a bunch of the best films of all time. This is one of, if not the best superhero film ever made. You don't need me to tell you that, but it's not really a superhero film. It's a crime thriller and one of the best of that genre. Extremely well-made, thematically rich, and tightly written, it's a story that explores the destructive and positive sides of humanity, which ends with good prevailing, but not in the way you'd expect. That trope is ingeniously flipped on its head in this film, and strangely enough, it feels the most detached of the Dark Knight trilogy. It stands on its own very well, and despite that, it still isn't my favorite of the trilogy. Yes, I stand by my position that The Dark Knight Rises is the best of Nolan's Batman films. People will always find things to complain about, like the classic "How did Bruce get back to Gotham?" But in my opinion, it finds the perfect way to wrap up the trilogy, by tying itself back into the story of Batman Begins and the themes of The Dark Knight. No one can change my mind that Bane is the best villain of the series. He combines the strength of Ra's al Ghul and the intellect of the Joker to create an antagonist who is formidable for Batman in more ways than one. Add on to that a classic journey of rebirth as Bruce Wayne takes up the mantle of Batman one last time, becoming the hero Gotham needs, along the way inspiring people like Selina Kyle and John Blake to do the same. The conclusion is also open-ended. It feels like the story can continue, but that continuation is left up to the interpretation of the audience. I'm not gonna act like this film is perfect, but I think it did exactly what it needed to do in the best way possible. At number 2, I have Dunkirk, and I'm just as surprised as some of you that it's this high on the list because I'm not usually a war movie guy. I find most war films to be relentlessly bleak and oppressive, and while Dunkirk does share some similarities with other war films, it's never felt that same way to me. It's one of Nolan's shortest films, but it feels never-ending because the tension never lets up. Hans Zimmer, through his use of the shepherd's tone, creates this continual sense of building dread which explodes at several points throughout the film. The 3 main plot lines, all running parallel to each other at different points in time, all converging towards the end of the film, is simply epic to behold, and that was a brilliant way of structuring the story. The main point of criticism for Dunkirk is that the characterization in it is weak. But people don't seem to understand that it isn't a film where characters have time to sit down and talk to each other about their deep, tragic backstories. They're constantly moving, and we learn information about them through their interactions in the midst of the action. People in war don't always have some great heroic goal, and that's how the characters are presented in this film. Most of them are just trying to survive, doing whatever they can to make it out of the situation alive. I find very little to dislike about Dunkirk. It isn't a film for everyone, but it completely works for me. And finally, at number 1, my favorite Christopher Nolan film is Interstellar. Now, I know some of you think this film is overrated, and if you're one of those people, then this is not the video for you, because I think it is the perfect amalgamation of all of Nolan's key components. Firstly, it's one of the most technically impressive films I've ever seen. It's nearly a decade old, and it still holds up magnificently. It's one of the times Nolan has been more reliant on CGI, but I would not be able to tell you when it is and isn't being used. In many ways, it's Nolan's largest concept, but with the most human center. The main theme of the film connects perfectly back to the concept on which it is based. The idea of Matthew McConaughey's love for his daughter being quantifiable across time and space, ultimately saving the entire human race, sounds incredibly cheesy on paper, but Nolan finds a way to make it work. There's really nothing to complain about. It's a masterpiece in every sense of the word. It's one of his films I've watched the most times, and I've loved it more on every viewing. With that being said, that's just about it for my ranking of all of Christopher Nolan's films. I find it fascinating that there's a person like him out there who has directed such a wide variety of films that appeal to people in different ways. My least favorite of his films might be your favorite, and that's why I would love for you guys to share with me your own ranking of Nolan's films, and whatever thoughts you may have on this video in the comments below. And of course, as always, I hope you guys have a great day. Take care.